Good morning, everybody. How are you on this Saturday morning? What's the weather like where you are on this winter, late fall day? My name is Tracy Brown, and I am so delighted to be with you on this week's Science of Mind and Spirit Saturday morning conversations, where just in case you're listening or watching for the first time, there is a group of us and we rotate through on Saturday mornings to spend about 45 or 50 minutes diving into some of the wisdom that is the foundation for the science of mind, or to share things that Ernest Holmes, the founder of Science of Mind, wrote that help us to understand universal spiritual principles more, to help us to apply universal spiritual principles more, and to help us be confident enough to share these universal principles with others. So, Science of Mind and Spirit Saturday morning conversations. And the other thing that's a little bit different with this program on the New Thought Media Network than compared to a few others is that we really, really love it when you comment. So, Wayne and Linda and Fiona, I am so glad you are with us and you are already modeling to put where you are from in the chat. And even if you're someone who is watching the recording, feel free to put your name and where you are watching from in the comments or in the chat. So let's take a deep breath together. I simply need 15 seconds of centering to go a little bit deeper because I love today's topic. So today we are going to be talking about how habits are formed. How habits are formed. Now, you may be thinking, what is that? What does that have to do with science of mind? Well, let me tell you. So much about what we teach in science of mind is really how to use spiritual principle, how to understand it so you can use it or apply it in your life. And so much of what we do in our lives is by habit. But what we forget often is that we are the ones who create the habits, right? We're the ones who keep doing things over and over and over and over, so much so that they become our default. And when we're applying universal spiritual principle, it's no different from that. We believe whatever we believe, and that drives our behavior. And we do that behavior again and again and again. With spiritual practice, you're probably just like me. The first time you meditated, you were like, I don't get it. Like, what? What's supposed to happen? Like, nothing's happening. But we call it a spiritual practice because we do it over and over and over until we embody it and it becomes our way of being, and it becomes a habit. So living based on spiritual principle also can be a habit that you or me or anyone can develop. Interestingly enough, um, Ernest Holmes had a radio show that most of you know. he had a radio show and called This Thing Called Life. And he had an episode of the show in 1951 where all he talked about for the whole show is how habits are formed. And so in the Science of Mind Librarian Archives, there is a transcript of his talk on the radio show about how habits are formed. Side note here, just for a moment, during the second half of this year, we have been featuring on this show, on the Saturday Morning Science of Mind Archives, we have been featuring content that you can find in the Science of Mind archives, Science of Mind Library and Archives. And so we're doing that because so many people think the only way they can learn about science of mind is to read the very dense, very deep textbook. And everybody can't slog through 600 pages of Ernest Holmes writing. And so in the first half of the year, we go through the textbook, literally chapter by chapter. But this year, during the third and fourth quarters, we have been diving into other writings by Ernest Holmes that also help you understand it at a deeper level, maybe a more practical level sometimes. And all of the materials we are using for that are coming from the Science of Mind archives. So please feel free, whether you love this topic today or you're just curious about other writings of Ernest Holmes, articles that were in Science of Mind magazine over the last 50 years, or actually longer, over the last 90 years, because the archives does include actual content, issues of the magazine from the 20s and 30s as well. So please visit the Science of Mind archives. And if you want to jump over there for today's content, then you can follow this link, or really just go to Science of Mind archives and then do a search for how habits are formed. Okay, so let's dive in. How habits are formed. Let's look at how he begins, just how he begins this talk that he gave. Friends, you and I are interested in learning how to use our minds and in the most effective way. We want to know how to think in such a manner that our lives will be happy and successful. And learning how to think rightly is like learning how to use any other set of tools. Most of us have felt that our lives are governed by our conscious thoughts, but it is now believed that almost 90% of our lives are controlled by habit patterns of thought. Habit thought patterns are different from our conscious thinking. For example, when you drive your automobile, you do not consciously think about applying your brake if you see a red traffic signal. The act of your foot being on the brake is automatic. This action has been repeated so often that the driver no longer has to think about it. A habit has been formed, and the habit pattern takes control of your actions as though some force or power other than yourself were operating. This matter of habits relates to almost every phase of our lives. And if we are going to get the most out of our mental tools, let's understand how thought patterns are established and what kind of thought patterns are best for us to live by. So I'm just curious. One, does that make sense to you? Two, when have you used conscious thought to apply spiritual principle in your life? And when do you realize unconscious thought is actually working in you as you or through you? I'm really curious. Does this idea and this understanding of the difference between conscious thought and unconscious thought, does it resonate with you? Does it make sense to you? And yes, Linda, it's not a complete coincidence that yesterday's Science of Mind magazine daily guide is about our habits. Um, it's it wasn't truly planned, but it's not a complete coincidence. Because this topic of habits, this time of year especially, both because we're going through the holiday season, are entering the winter, the heaviest winter holiday season with so many different celebrations happening between Thanksgiving and Epiphany in January. Um, that a lot of what we do is habitual and we don't really think about it. But also, this is a time of year where we really start looking at habits because we begin to prepare for the new year. And even, I don't do New Year's resolutions, but people who do, what they're looking at is what habits do I want to break or what new habits do I want to instill. So, absolutely. This is a good time of year in late November to pay attention to the habits that we have and to really begin to be conscious of how we're building our habits. So hopefully all of you can think about and can think of at least one or two examples where you realize, oh, I'm just on default, what Ernest Holmes refers to as patterns of habits or patterns of thought that we become unconscious of. And that can be good, like knowing when you see a red traffic signal or a stop sign that your foot automatically moves to the brake if you're driving. It has a really good use. And all that we are learning and reminding each other of is that we can actually use that to program ourselves the same way we might program our computer or laptop or phone to do what we want it to do. So let's keep reading a little bit from Ernest Holmes. This matter of habits relates to almost every phase of our life. And if we are going to get the most out of our mental tools, let's understand how thought patterns are established. So that's what he went into in his talk in 1951, this understanding how habits are formed. And he tells the story that some of you may be familiar with of the the psychology experiments that were done. And he describes the one with a patient where they were shining a light in front of the patient's eyes. And at the same time the light was turned on, a bell was rung. So imagine this, that a light is shining in your eyes and a bell rings. So you're engaging two senses, sight or vision and hearing at the same time over and over and over. Well, as you can imagine, when the light is shining in your eyes, right, your pupils actually contract, right, in reaction or response to this bright light coming into your eyes. And so after that pattern has been established in this series of experiments, the patient was given a switch or, a toggle switch so that they could control the light and the bell. When the doctor would say contract, the patient would close his hand, squeeze the switch, and it turned on the light and rang the bell. So, in response to a direction of contract, the patient would then have the light and the sound. And once this was done over and over and over again, Ernest Holmes said, in reporting these experiments, he said, after this was done enough times to have established a habit, the light and the bell were both taken away. Then an interesting thing was noticed. The doctor would just say to the patient, contract. The patient would close his hand as previously instructed, and the pupils of his eyes would contract. Now, you might think that wouldn't happen to me. I'm not that gullible. I have enough control. And I would say to you, rubbish. I would say to you, actually, that is what our brain is trained to do. Our brain is trained physiologically, right? Our brain serves the purpose of looking for patterns, looking for repetition, watching for emotional engagement, and putting those three things together: repetition, emotional engagement, right? And what are the triggers for that? This cues this action, and it becomes so automatic, whether we label it good or bad. If we feel something so strongly, and our emotions are very tied into what's happening, that strong emotion can lock that in so that our brain will reconnect with that emotion, or reconnect with that behavior, or reconnect with that situation because the emotional surge was so high. Or you may not have a lot of emotion about a thing, but because you repeat it every day or on a regular basis, the brain catalogs that into it is something you do or believe. I'm careful about saying it's something you want, because it might not be something you want, but it's a state or a belief or an action that you take over and over and over and over again. So your brain doesn't know any better but to think this is what is important. And so you've got to have your own examples. Dr. Ray gives his example, like comfort eating when triggered emotionally is a default response. And so default response is exactly a perfect phrase. If you want to use a phrase different from habit, it's your default response. But here's the kicker. We have trained our brain and body to create that default response. It doesn't happen out of magic, or right, it happens because we have trained our brain to think a certain way, or to respond a certain way, or to stimulus. So what does Ernest Holmes have to say about this? Up to this point, there is one thing that we should notice about these experiments. They've all been built and carried out on a basis of suggestion. But here it seems to me is the place where the most revealing part of the power of mind enters into the experiment. Finally, after different things, the doctor simply sat down by his patient and thought the word contract, and the pupils of the patient's eyes contracted. Doesn't this indicate the oneness of mind? A generation past, it would have seemed beyond the realm of imagination that one person could sit and think a certain thing and have another person respond to it. This could not happen, you see, unless there were but one mind of which each of us is a part. We've been accustomed to think that you have a mind and I have a mind and our friend has a mind. But the evidence now shows us that there is but one mind, and each of us, in our own way, uses that one mind. We tap into it. And our use of it is mostly in the formation of habits. The doctor's patient had established the habit of responding physically to a specific word. That word was contract. And the response was the contraction of the pupils of the eyes. Wouldn't it be interesting to find out how many of us have certain command words or situations or conditions to which we respond in certain ways? We would probably learn that almost every moment of the day, we are unconsciously listening to some kind of command and responding to it in exactly the way we've been trained to respond. Listen up. I love this next paragraph, and depending on the size of your screen, you may be reading it along with me. So, think how we react to such words as weariness, fatigue, or sorrow. And then let's contrast this or compare this to how differently we respond when we hear words like wonderful, beautiful, happiness, peace. In each case, you see, these are commands. That's all. They're commands that we have learned to react to in a certain way. It is little wonder that Jesus said, "The words I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life." I'm shaking my head because this is such a perfect integration of science, mental science, and spiritual science. So, recapping, right, Ernest Holmes makes that connection of oneness and the one mind, and that all of us are tapping into this one source, even though it feels like we are completely separate, that we are impacted by cultural consciousness, and we are all interacting and living in the universal consciousness that is all life. So I love that he makes it that connection. It makes it really clear for us and reminds us, and that habit is the inevitable, the totally predictable effect or consequence of what we feed into our brain, our body, our patterns of life. So even if we're not thinking about it, we are, again, programming the computer of our body. And yes, it's so cool that this is the science of the physical mind or brain, but it is also the science of the capital M, universal spiritual creation of all of life mind as well. And we are operating within that. It's so easy to forget and to get caught up in our human, right, bloated thinking, the bloated nothingness, but our beliefs about we're individual, we're independent, we are creating our own lives, and we are in complete control of what happens all the time. But the ancient wisdom, the universal spiritual truth that is happening is bigger, broader, deeper. Right? We are all tapping into the one mind, and that allows us to communicate with each other, both in tangible and intangible, visible and invisible ways. And so much of what we do is habitual. So the phrase that so many people attribute to New Thought is change your thinking, change your life. Change your thinking, change your life. If you change your thinking, you can be what Wayne says. We can be the master of our sea, because it is our thinking that drives what we experience, how we interpret the experiences we have, what we do with the experience, how we build on the experience. And by changing our thinking, we open the door and welcome new habits, deeper or shifted beliefs. And so, I don't know. It's like a part of me is like, why do we act like it's so confusing? It's not confusing. It just requires us to be conscious. And if we are experiencing something that does not reflect our deepest desires, then we are able to form a new habit. So Fiona hits it right, right there at the source or at the core of what Ernest Holmes is teaching here. Each one of us has the ability to choose what to think and to feel, and therefore make changes in our lives. When we change the way we perceive the world will change automatically due to the law of resonance and a dozen other laws that come into play as we actually form a new habit or reinforce the habits that have already been formed. Now, I love this comment, Fiona. It is so on target. I'm going to expand a little bit on that first sentence. Each one of us has the ability to choose what to think and to feel. Now, all of us know that there are times when we are feeling a certain way about ourselves or about the people we're interacting with or about the circumstances of the world, and it doesn't feel good. And we have to be a little careful when we are talking about uh, choosing our thoughts and our feelings, because we are in a human experience and we are always going to respond or react. React is the better word here. We're going to react to the things around us. But if we don't appreciate the way we're reacting, or we see that the way we're reacting does not serve us, then we can consciously choose to form a new habit, as Ernest Holmes talks about in this particular show, because we understand how habits are formed. So when we often are on default and we are doing, thinking, or feeling certain things that are a reflection of the default that was planted in us as a child, or we learned very young, when we're around these kinds of people, we were trained, on purpose or not, to respond a certain way. So as an adult, I may say that no longer serves me, and I don't believe that anymore, or I understand why I think that way, but I don't want to think that anymore. Then we go into the process of forming a new habit. So Ernest Holmes goes on to talk about why we respond the way that we do, and helps us further understand how to actually shift. So once we understand how habits are formed, he reminds us, as this episode of this thing called life goes on. And I want to share with you what he had to say about that. But before I do that, we're going to take a little 1-minute break. Don't go away. I'll be back with more about how habits are formed by Ernest Holmes.
On behalf of everyone at New Thought Media Network, thank you for being a member of our virtual family. Your financial contributions help share the New Thought message with people from around the world. Please visit and contribute at www.ntmedia.org/donate. New Thought Media Network, come be you. And please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, peace and blessings.
So I love all of the promos and intros at New Thought Media Network, because almost all the time you will catch me behind the camera dancing to the music. So we are talking about how habits are formed. And oh my goodness, in true Ernest Holmes fashion, he sets up in the first part of this talk, right? He sets up the foundation, what habits are about, but he does not leave you there with just the philosophical or psychological understanding. There is no mistake why science of mind is called a faith, a philosophy, and what's number 3? Faith, philosophy, and a way of life. And so let's see what Ernest Holmes has to say about the way of life if we want to form new habits. Okay, he says, if we want to form these new thought patterns, we simply begin to use new command words and persist until they work automatically for us. I'm laughing because we often are expecting some, like, I don't know, magic key. And we're the magic, right? We're the key. That first sentence, as he closes into or moves to go into the practical application, that first sentence says it all. If we want to form these new thought patterns, we simply begin to use new command words and persist until they work automatically for us. So let's go about this in a direct way. Let's stop for a moment and examine our own words, our own commands. How many of us are listening to the confusion of the world and all of the words that go to make up this confusion? But then he encourages us by saying, even in the face of all this confusion, we can still speak a word of peace. And we can speak a word of peace with authority because we know that behind humanity's conflicts, there is always that peace of God which is never disturbed by our strife. When we become disturbed inside about anything, that's the moment to be still and say peace. And when we are afraid of anything, that's the time to speak the word faith. When we become angry or listen to words of hatred, that is the moment to use the word love. Somebody is saying, it just can't be that simple. Yeah, it's not easy, but it is simple. As a Black person living in the 21st century and the 20th century, there are plenty of times when I've been like, hey, I'm a good person and I've done my prayers. Why is someone disrespecting me because of the color of my skin? It happens. I don't have any control over anyone else's actions, but when I am feeling hurt or afraid for my life, which has happened more times than I would like to admit, I can choose what to do with my rage, my anger, my fear. I can remind myself of the spiritual truth. I can physically, in my human experience, move to safety, but I also have to move to emotional, mental, psychological, and spiritual safety. And I do that through spiritual practice. When I am coaching or working or with or supporting someone who's had an unexpected medical diagnosis that brings on fear, right? We replace fear with faith, which are really the same energy, just one is completely believing in good coming from this, and the other completely believing that bad is coming from this. Fear and faith, they are the same continuum. Anger and peace, they are the same continuum. They're just different interpretations of what the circumstances, the physical current circumstance is telling you. And so I love that Ernest Holmes reminds us that the thought patterns we build only get built because we applies meaning to specific words, which he talks about as command words, and psychology talks about as command words, until we have the automatic nature or the experience that comes from that response. Does this make any sense to you? And if it does, have you ever used it? Do you have an example in your own life where you have shifted the meaning of certain words so that you respond, or certain circumstances where you respond differently, right? And so instead of the fear, or you turn to faith. Instead of the anger, you turn to love. Instead of hatred, you turn to harmony, right? Where in your life have you done this? And how has it made you feel? And did you understand you were taking control, that you were using the power of universal spiritual principle, where the universe must respond in the way that you, or to deliver that which you believe must come from this situation or this pattern of activity. So the pattern in the world might be one thing, but the pattern within yourself is something else. So Ernest Holmes goes on to remind us of this when he says, we must let the words of faith and love and life become so deeply seated in our minds that we use them automatically. And when this happens to us, when we have acquired this spiritual habit, we shall discover that life responds to the words we use in exactly the same way we use them. As Jesus said, thy faith has made thee whole, and love casts out fear. It's wonderful that you and I are free to choose words of power and words of life. This itself is the gift of God, a gift so freely given, but so seldom used. And now we wish to use this power that we may get more out of life and contribute more to it. This piece is so wonderful. And it reminds us that we do have the power to influence what is happening in the world around us, or at least we have the power to influence how we respond to whatever is going on around us. And so, again, I just want to remind you, this is available if you want to read it again or read it for yourself and read the parts that I didn't read. You can find this document by going to the Science Mind archives and doing a search for how habits are formed. I want to thank you for participating in the Saturday morning Science of Mind conversations. I love the comments that you've placed in the chat. And our time is just about up. So I just want to encourage you to join in every Saturday for another chance to dive deeper and make the commitment to embody this teaching more fully. And as you go into the rest of the week, remember, you can join into the New Thought Media Network every day. There's prayer 3 times a day. There's opportunities to submit prayer requests. And there are so many good shows in the programming throughout the week. So please Don't just wait till next Saturday, but join us throughout the week on the network and keep yourself filled up with new thought, philosophy, and how to apply it in your own life. My name is Tracy Brown, and that's it for this episode of Saturday Science Mind Conversations. I hope you have a fabulous, fabulous week.